What if Echo Base was overrun by Wampas? Echo Base was silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of abandonment. Ice cracked and shifted as the winds howled through the open hangar doors, whipping through the empty corridors, carrying with it the ghosts of a battle fought and lost. The last of the rebel transports had lifted off hours ago, the final X-Wings screaming into the freezing hot sky, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of war. The battle was over, or so they thought. Beneath a collapsed corridor, entombed under ice and wreckage, a rebel groaned. Blood trickled down the side of his head, his vision swimming. His fingers twitched against the frozen ground. He forced himself to move, shoving at the debris, and with a heavy grunt, he broke free. He wasn't alone. Corporal Davin Solas staggered to his feet, his breath misting in the freezing air. His left arm throbbed from the impact of the collapse, and his head pounded from where he'd struck it. Blinking against the dizziness, he took in his surroundings. The corridor was partially caved in, ice and metal twisted together in a heap behind him. The emergency lights flickered red, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The familiar hum of Echo Base's systems was gone. Nothing but the distant wind howling outside. He reached for his comm, static hissing in response. Broken. He cursed under his breath and drew his blaster, the cold biting through his gloves. Somewhere in the distance, a noise echoed. Not the wind. A voice. Davin moved cautiously through the abandoned halls, his boots crunching against the frost-covered metal. He rounded a corner and stopped. A rebel trooper, Sergeant Hal Corrin, stood over a third man slumped against a bulkhead. Blood had seeped into the snow at his feet. Corrin turned sharply at the sound of Davin's boots. The tension in his stance faded when he saw the familiar rebel uniform. "You're alive," Corrin breathed. "Barely," Davin muttered. "What happened to him?" "Blaster wound to the side. Not that deep, but he's out cold." Davin moved to the injured man and crouched, pressing two fingers to his neck. A pulse, weak but steady. He recognized the unconscious trooper, Private Lorne Vex, a demolitions expert from another squad. Corrin straightened, rubbing his arms for warmth. "I woke up buried in the snow, just outside the command center. Dragged Vex in here after I found him. Thought we were the only ones left." Davin frowned. "We're not." Corrin narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Before Davin could answer, they heard another noise. A metallic clatter. Footsteps. Then voices. Not rebels. Imperials. Davin and Corrin pressed their backs against the wall, blasters drawn. From the darkness ahead, figures emerged, their white armor dimly illuminated by the flickering red emergency lights. 5 stormtroopers, followed by a tall officer in a tattered Imperial coat, marched through the corridor, scanning their surroundings. Davin's grip on his blaster tightened. He counted 15 Imperials in total, scattered across Echo Base, sweeping through the remains of the outpost. Corrin cursed under his breath. They must have been left behind to gather information. The officer, a grim-looking man with a scar across his jaw, signaled for his squad to spread out. Their voices carried through the halls. "Check for data terminals. Anything we can salvage from the rebel systems." One of the stormtroopers gestured toward the main corridor. "Sir, the hangar's still intact. The shuttle is operational." The officer nodded. "Good. We extract what we can, then we get off this frozen rock." Davin exchanged a glance with Corrin. They were outnumbered, low on supplies, and cut off from any chance of reinforcements. They could wait for the Imperials to leave. But then, something else echoed through the corridors. Something inhuman. A deep, guttural roar. The Imperials stopped. The rebels froze. The air felt suddenly colder. "Sir, what was that?" a stormtrooper asked, gripping his blaster tighter. No one answered. The Imperials turned as one, weapons raised. The officer narrowed his eyes, stepping forward cautiously. "Steady," he ordered. A second roar rumbled through the icy corridors. Then another. The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing through Echo Base's metal halls. The officer signaled to his men. "Fan out. Find out what we're dealing with." Two stormtroopers hesitated before moving toward the source of the noise. Their blasters aimed down the corridor. Their boots crunched over the frost-covered flooring, flashlights cutting through the red haze. Davin and Corrin exchanged uneasy glances from their hiding place. Neither had ever heard anything like those roars before. "What the hell are they walking into?" Corrin whispered. Davin swallowed. "I don't think we want to find out." From deeper within the base, something heavy moved. The stormtroopers edged forward. Then, a blur of white fur. A massive wampa lunged from the shadows, its razor-sharp claws slashing at the first trooper's armor as if it were paper. Blood sprayed across the ice. The second trooper barely had time to scream before a wampa tore into him, dragging his body into the darkness. Panic erupted. "Contact!" Blaster fire filled the corridor. Red bolts streaked through the air, illuminating flashes of fur and clawed hands. More wampas emerged from side tunnels. The officer shouted, trying to rally his men, but their blaster rifles were malfunctioning, frozen solid. "Blast it! The cold seized the power cells!" a trooper yelled, frantically trying to fix his weapon. The Wampas did not wait. They charged. One stormtrooper managed to fire before his rifle died, his shot grazing a Wampa's shoulders. The beast snarled in pain, but did not stop. It tore through him, lifting him off his feet and slamming his body into the wall with a sickening crunch. "Fall back!" the officer bellowed. The remaining 5 Imperials broke into a full retreat, sprinting back toward the heart of Echo Base. Davin and Corrin ducked lower, eyes wide. The Wampas didn't chase, not immediately. Instead, they turned toward the dead. The sounds of ripping flesh and crunching bone filled the air. Corrin looked away. "We need to move. Now." Davin nodded. He grabbed Vex's unconscious form, and the two rebels slipped deeper into the shadows as the surviving Imperials ran for their lives. The Imperials fled into a narrow corridor, breath heaving in their helmets. The officer led them into a small storage bay, slamming a security door shut behind them. For a moment, only silence. The officer, Lieutenant Cale Varric, gritted his teeth. "Status!" he barked. One of the surviving troopers, Sergeant Harlan, checked their numbers. "Just the 5 of us left, sir." Cale clenched his jaw. 10 men. Gone in seconds. Torn apart by monsters he hadn't even known existed. "We need to reach the shuttle," Harlan panted. "If we stay here, we're dead." Another trooper, Marek, was still staring at the blood smeared across his armor. His hands were shaking. They hunted us. Cale snapped his fingers in front of the soldier's visor. Get a hold of yourself! The sounds of distant roars echoed through the halls. Cale exhaled sharply. We move together. Keep your weapons at the ready. They opened the door and came face to face with the 3 rebel soldiers. Davin and Corrin had their blasters raised, Vex standing weakly behind them. For a long, tense moment, neither side moved. Then, a low growl reverberated from behind the Imperials. The Wampas had found them. The growl rumbled through the ice-ridden corridor like distant thunder. The red emergency lights cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating the Imperials and rebels frozen in a tense standoff. Lieutenant Cale Varric and Davin locked eyes, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, the Wampa roared again. A blur of white fur emerged from the darkness behind Imperials. Move! Davin shouted. The Imperials and rebels scattered just as the Wampa charged. The creature's claws slammed into the wall, sending shards of ice flying. One of the stormtroopers wasn't fast enough. The Wampa's massive hand clamped around his torso. He screamed, struggling against its grip, but the beast lifted him like a rag doll and slammed him into the ground. His helmet cracked apart, his body going limp. Fire! Fire! Cale shouted. Blaster bolts filled the corridor, streaking red across the walls. The Wampa snarled in pain, staggering back as multiple shots hit its thick hide. But it didn't go down. Fall back, Davin ordered, already moving. The survivors bolted into an adjacent hallway, slamming a door shut behind them. But one of the Imperials did not make it. His screams echoed into the night. The reinforced Jorasteel groaned as the Wampa threw itself against it. But for now, the barrier held. Silence. The only sound was their heavy breathing. Then, Cale turned his blaster on Davin. You almost got us killed! Davin narrowed his eyes, levelling his own weapon. We saved your lives. Cale clenched his jaw, looking around at what remained of his squad. Only 3 of them now. His second in command, Sergeant Harlan, stepped forward. Sir, Harlan said, glancing at the locked door. We can't afford to fight each other right now. Davin and Corrin nodded. The Wampas are hunting all of us, Davin said. We work together, or we don't leave this place at all. Cale exhaled sharply. He knew the rebels were right. Fine, he said. For now. A loud, muffled announcement crackled over the base's ancient speakers. Warning! Energy generator unstable. Evacuation advised. The alarms began to blare. Red lights flashed overhead, and the temperature dropped even further. Cale turned back to Davin. We need a way out. Now. They quickly found an old command room, its monitors flickering weakly. Corrin worked the controls, accessing a map of Echo Base. The main hangar is here, she said, pointing. Your shuttle still intact? Cale nodded. But the Wampas have already attacked it. It might be damaged. Vex, still weak, but recovering, sighed. Great. So we might be fighting for a ship that won't even fly. Davin looked back at the base map, analysing their situation. The Wampas are everywhere, he muttered. If we just run for the hangar, they'll tear us apart. Cale crossed his arms. Then what do you suggest? Davin thought for a moment, then pointed at 3 different sections of the map. We split into 3 teams. 1 Imperial, 1 Rebel per team. Cale narrowed his eyes. Why? so neither side can betray the other. Cale held his glare for a moment, then nodded. All right, what's the plan? Davin leaned forward. The first team would lower the Wampas already inside Echo Base deeper into the abandoned sections. They would then escape through the ventilation system. The second team would draw the remaining Wampas away from the shuttle by leading them through the maintenance tunnels. The third team would wait for both distractions, then make a break for the shuttle. If we time this right, Davin said, we can get to your shuttle before the Wampas realise what's happening. Cale nodded. It's risky, but it's our best shot. The teams were chosen. Corrin and Sergeant Harlan would handle the ventilation escape. Vex and Marek would lead the Wampas through the tunnel. Davin and Cale would wait for their moment to sprint for the shuttle. Then, the power suddenly flickered. The announcement repeated, this time more distorted. Warning. Generator. Unstable. Evac. The red lights dimmed, then brightened again. The base was on the verge of explosion. Cale looked at Davin. Let's move. The cold bit through their armour and uniforms as they separated into teams. Every breath came out as mist, every step crunching against the frozen floor. Corrin and Harlan headed for the ventilation shafts, their footsteps echoing into the dark. Vex and Marek made for the tunnels, disappearing into the labyrinth of ice and steel. Davin and Cale remained behind, gripping their weapons and waiting for the chaos to unfold. The first team made their move. Corrin and Harlan moved silently through the corridors, staying low, their flashlights cutting through the red-lit darkness. Then, a shadow moved. A Wampa lurked ahead, sniffing the air. Corrin raised her blaster, holding her breath. Harlan whispered, "Steady." Corrin fired. The shot slammed into the Wampa's back, burning a wound into its thick fur. The creature roared, turning with rage in its small, predatory eyes. "Run!" Harlan yelled. They sprinted down the hallway, the sound of Wampas thundering after them. Each step the beasts took, the ground shook beneath them. They reached the vent entrance, a metal grate, but it was partially broken. "Inside, now!" Corrin said. She scrambled in first, twisting through the narrow space. Harlan turned to follow, but he didn't fit. The vent was collapsed too much. His armour was too bulky. The Wampa's roar grew closer. Corrin twisted back, reaching for him. "Take off your chest plate!" Harlan grabbed at the latches, ripping the armour away. Too late. The Wampa slammed into him. A clawed hand wrapped around his throat. Corrin screamed as Harlan was yanked away. His blaster fired wildly, shots ricocheting as he vanished into the darkness. His final, choking scream was cut off by a sickening crunch. Corrin trembled. She forced herself deeper into the vents, crawling through the ice-cold metal. She was alone. But she had a chance. She kept moving. Vex and Marek moved quickly through the maintenance tunnels, hearing the distant howls of Wampas behind them. Marek whispered, "How many do you think are following us?" Vex glanced back, his flashlight flickered. Then, two massive white shapes moved in the dark. Vex turned forward. "Doesn't matter, just keep running." The tunnel twisted sharply, turning into a steep incline. They reached the top, then skidded to a halt. A cave-in. The tunnel was blocked. "No, no, no!" Marek muttered, turning back. But the Wampas were already there. No escape. Vex gritted his teeth. "If we're dying here," he said, lifting his blaster, "we take them with us." The first Wampa charged. Vex and Marek opened fire. Red bolts seared into the fur. The Wampa staggered, roaring in pain. Then the second one attacked. It slammed into Marek, sending him crashing into the ice. He screamed as claws dug into his chest. Then, silenced as the beast's jaws crunched down on his throat. Vex yelled in fury, firing point blank into the creature's skull. The second Wampa collapsed, but the first was still standing. It grabbed Vex's arm, twisting, breaking. Vex screamed. The Wampa loomed over him, claws raised. Then it struck. Darkness. Davin and Kale had been waiting. The distant roars and blaster fire signaled that the others had done their part. Kale clenched his jaw. "We need to move, now." They sprinted through the corridors, boots hammering against the ice. Ahead, the hangar doors loomed. The shuttle was still there, but sparks crackled from its hull. "Looks damaged," Davin muttered. Kale didn't slow. "We fix it or we die." The doors slammed open. A cold wind rushed in. Then, another sound. A Wampa bellowed. Davin and Kale turned. A pack of them had seen them, and they were coming. Kale's eyes widened. Davin and Kale sprinted across the frozen hangar, their boots sliding over the ice. Behind them, the roars of the Wampas grew louder. The shuttle loomed ahead, a Lambda-class transport, its hull riddled with claw marks and blaster burns. Kale vaulted onto the loading ramp and immediately ducked inside, assessing the damage. Davin turned, lifting his rifle. He had to buy time. He could hear the roars of the Wampas getting closer. They were coming back. Davin's heart pounded. "Kale, how bad is it?" Kale cursed. "Hyperdrive shot. Power cells are unstable. We've got minutes before this thing is spaceworthy." Davin tightened his grip on his rifle. Minutes. He could hold out for minutes. Corrin burst out of the narrow ventilation shaft, her body slamming onto the icy floor of the hangar. She had no time to recover. Behind her, the thunderous roars of the Wampas grew deafening. Corrin scrambled to her feet and ran. Ahead, the Lambda-class shuttle sat in the open hangar, its engines beginning to hum with life. Davin was on the loading ramp, blaster raised. "Come on, Corrin!" he shouted. She ran faster. The Wampas poured into the hangar, their hulking forms shaking the ground as they gave chase. Davin opened fire. Red blaster bolts lanced across the darkness, striking the beasts in bursts of burning flesh. One stumbled and fell. Another reeled back, roaring in pain. But more were coming. Corrin was almost there. Kale's voice crackled over the comms. "Repairs are done. We have to go, now." Davin didn't respond. His focus was on Corrin's final stretch. She was nearly at the ship. Just a few more steps. Then, a shadow moved from the side. A new Wampa lunged from the wreckage of a fallen snowspeeder. One that had been hidden, waiting. Corrin barely had time to scream. A massive arm swung out. The impact sent her spinning. Her body hit the ice, and before she could move, claws tore through her armor, slicing deep. Davin's world blurred in horror. "Corrin!" He fired, but it was too late. The Wampa ripped her apart. Kale hit the thrusters. The shuttle lifted off, engines roaring. Davin still firing blindly at the monster that had killed her. The last thing he saw was the Wampas swarming the hangar, their eyes gleaming red in the emergency lighting. Then the ship shot into the sky, leaving Echo Base and Corrin's broken body behind. The Lambda-class shuttle shot out of Echo Base's hangar, the planet's surface a blur of ice and rock below. Davin slumped against the bulkhead, his breath ragged. Blood dripped from his armour where the Wampas' claws had torn through. Cale sat in the pilot's seat, hands shaking as he gripped the controls. "We're clear," he muttered. Davin exhaled, trying to steady himself. "The others?" Cale didn't answer. He didn't have to. They were the only ones left. Then, a massive explosion ripped through the remains of Echo Base. The shuttle shook violently as the energy generator detonated, sending a shockwave across the tundra. A fireball erupted, briefly turning the frozen wasteland into an inferno. Then, silence. Cale and Davin watched the destruction below, neither speaking. Finally, Cale exhaled. "We should land." Davin nodded, staring at the endless stretch of white and black below. "Yeah." They weren't safe yet. The shuttle touched down on a remote plateau, away from any possible threat. Davin and Cale stepped out, their bodies crunching against the ice. For the first time, the cold felt real. The adrenaline was wearing off. The reality of what they had just survived settled in. Davin activated his distress beacon, sending out a coded rebel signal. Cale did the same for the Empire. They stood there, staring at each other. Cale crossed his arms. "Guess this is it." Davin smirked tiredly. "Guess so." A moment of silence. Then, Cale held out his hand. Davin hesitated, but shook it. For one night, they had been allies. For one night, they had fought together. But as the lights of the Imperial and Rebel transports appeared in the sky, both men knew that the next time they met, it would be as enemies once more. The wind howled around them. Neither spoke another word. They turned and left Echo Base behind. Drop the scenarios you would like to see in the comments, and I will pick one every week for Fan Friday. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one.